Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. This week on the show, the end of capitalism? Maybe, says author Paul Mason. Plus, journalist Patrick Cockburn on the latest news on ISIS. And a few words from me on what is missing from Pride. Welcome to the Laura Flanders Show, where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the ones who are doing it. A new way of living is in the process of formation. Capitalism, as we know it, has reached the limits of its ability to adapt. A networked alternative is already in the works. You can see it in the cooperative businesses we report on this program, and in the very tough time traditional parties are having keeping old hierarchies in place. There is no more exciting or important story to report on. That's what I think. Paul Mason agrees. He's economics editor at Channel 4 News in the United Kingdom. He joined us often from the front lines of the anti-austerity rebellions in Europe and the Middle East after the financial crash of 2008. Now he's out with a new book, Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future, just published by Farrar Straus Giroux. Welcome back, Paul. Great to have you.
It's nice to be here.
Here and in the flesh.
Well,
so we could geek out on the economics in your book, which is like an education in itself. But I want to start with the politics that we're in right now. How do you see this post-capitalist scenario playing out in our election debacle?
look, part of the analysis in the book is about why elites, why hierarchies are falling apart. But there's a very clear reason why the US political elite and hierarchy is falling apart. It's because the economic model doesn't work. So it all, I'm afraid it does lead back to the geekery of economics. Why doesn't what we call the neoliberal model work anymore? And that's what I've tried to explain in the book. Now, on top of that, we have here, a networked generation, a young generation. You hear them at Bernie Sanders rallies, but you can actually trace them right the way back through Occupy, through the people who mobilized for Obama's initial campaign, right the way through back to Howard Dean. Howard Dean was the first Democrat to take seriously networked politics. So I think, what we're seeing with the Sanders campaign is very much a product of a sudden rise of networked politics. The question is, of course, where does it go after the nominations are concluded?
So if neoliberalism was still working, what would be happening? What would we be seeing differently from what we're seeing now?
Look, every 50 years or so, capitalism goes through a mutation. It's so different by the end of the mutation that it doesn't look like the capitalism that came before. Here in New York City, just look up, or any of the cities of America, you see buildings built during the last great period of expansion, either the 1940s and 50s, or the period just before the First World War, the Teddy Roosevelt era. And in those periods, what happens? New jobs come along to replace old ones that are being automated. These new jobs, if labor fights hard enough, are often better paid. You also get new needs. So radio replaces vaudeville. Right. The movies replace vaudeville. This is just not happening now, and I trace the reason right back to information. Information is a different kind of technological revolution. It produces cheap stuff or free stuff, and it tends to push wages down because it automates without creating the new jobs that we usually see at this phase in the cycle of the economy.
You're saying that the information technology and the economy based around information is really a different animal altogether to the kinds of technologies we've seen before?
Yeah, look, we could, if we really wanted to, a bit of industrial anthropology, we could go out to the nearest place from here where there's a lot of small engineering factories, and I guarantee you we would find machines in those places jealously hoarded, probably going right back to the 1950s. Every time I go to a factory, it's a great moment. You see an old piece of material. Okay, information doesn't work like that. Information revolutionizes. Information is only machines. Software is a machine, a computer is a machine, a silicon chip is a machine. It revolutionizes the efficiency and the price falls off a cliff. So the price of 1 million transistors printed on a silicon chip in 1992 was $222, and it's now 6 cents. And you think, so what? Well, that 1 million transistors was what we used to call a 486 computer, a Pentium 4. Yeah, you might remember that. Yeah. So effectively, a Pentium 4's processing power is now free, and that means we don't need to hoard the Pentium
Yeah.
4. It's a different kind of technological revolution. I think it's as big as the printing press.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
that
you
big.
say in your book that it transforms our relationship to wages, to land, to labor, to all of the traditional things that have been the deciding factors in economics.
Well, it's not just me who says that. There's a very strong school of thought inside mainstream economics that discovered this more or less as soon as we discovered the Command C, Command V. You can reproduce things for free with very little energy, very little labor. What the economists who studied that said, look, this stuff is going to end up free. And I think for the last 25 years, we've seen business models react to that fact by working out ever more clever ways to make stuff that should or could be free very expensive.
Give us an example.
99 cents a track on iTunes. Now, I have to say to your audience, remember that. But when I started writing the book, that's what it was. Yeah. In the sense that if you have a 95% market share, you can set the price of something that could be reproduced for free at 99 cents, irrespective of supply, demand, quality. The whole model of iTunes was based on making stuff that could be very, very cheap or free, quite expensive. What happened to it? Well, the sharing sites came along, and in the UK we have Spotify, Deezer, I don't know, everyone that there's in the USA. But what's the outcome? The amount of money you earn as a music artist dramatically falls once competition kicks in, because you're creating something that you can only defend with lawyers. Now, lawyers are a part of capitalism, but anything that has to be completely reproduced by law every morning with an insistence, take this down, you can't copy this, is not the same capitalism as the kind of capitalism that functions spontaneously, almost kind of without lawyers and without a state.
And then the last other option that I think doesn't come in for so much attention in your book, but I think we're seeing very much here, is war. I mean, war has always been a good engine, right after land and labor. We have war to keep our capitalism going. We do have an awful lot of wars, and then if we're not using those tools, those weapons abroad, we tend to bring them back onto our streets. Why won't that save capitalism?
Well, I think what we're looking for here is, look, we're in the middle of the biggest tech innovation boom ever. I mean, literally, our command, our power over nature and ourselves is greater than ever, thanks to technology, and the world economy is stagnating. Now, the USA had a few good years because of the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing program and the ease with which you can create very cheap labor, precarious jobs, I would argue. But that's not a takeoff. And central bankers all over the world, I mean, America is the exception here, all over the world, central bankers are terrified of stagnation, negative interest rates. I mean, negative interest rates mean that the safest form of capital doesn't earn any money. It costs you, to store a dollar, costs you a cent. You come back with 99 cents, come what may, no matter what risk you have taken there. So it's not working, and I think that what is coming down the tracks. I mean, you say war. I mean, I'm more concerned about geopolitical instability and breakup. I think sooner or later. It's happening now. One or other developed country will head for the exit of the global system and say, look, our own people can't stand this any longer, and therefore we're going to do some very traditional things, such as Roosevelt did in 1933. We're going to, shore up our own banking system, kind of already done across the world. We're going to look after our own people. We're going to put trade barriers up against. It's usually posed as other people dumping their stuff on us.
So. Okay, I think we've covered the territory. Now we get to the exciting part, which is if we were to see the upside of the post-capitalist world, not just the nasty ructions of the dying system, what might we find? What have you been looking at?
Well, I think there is already a post-capitalist sector of the economy, and we could segment it either vertically or horizontally. Let's look vertically. In the Spanish region of Catalonia, since the 2008 crash, there is a good academic study that shows how many ordinary people had to fall back on collaborative, unpaid, sharing, kind of free production as a result simply of the fact that there was no other way to live. The welfare system was falling apart. There's no welfare anywhere. There's no jobs. The sociologist Manuel Castells, who studied this, found that 1 in 3 people in that region had lent people money at zero interest who were non-family members, or they'd participated in time banks, so volunteering, or collaborative community creches. Often in a country in southern Europe, agriculture is really easy in a hot country, people literally just go back to the land. This is happening right now in Italy. There's a big movement of unemployed young people who are saying enough with the urban life, trying to wait tables and juggle 3 jobs. If I'm going to be poor, let's be poor on grandmother's village in a mountain where it's beautiful, and let's do painting and poetry. So no, I don't think that's the route to the future, but we do see, we have enabled, as it were, in the physical world, ourselves to collaborate better. And the technology is important because, of course, there's a technological equivalent of all this kind of commune stuff, which is Wikipedia, Linux, Apache, a load of other open source software and even products that people produce as a kind of gift in the hope that a gift will come back to them. It's almost a replica of the early gift economies that anthropologists found in kind of far-flung islands in the South Pacific.
We don't have a whole lot more time, but a couple of questions left. One is, what role does the state play in any of this? It used to be socialists would talk about central planning and industrial planning. In the networked world that you're describing, does the state have a role still?
The reason I wrote this book, above all, is observing the movements of 2011 here in Spain, in Greece, in the UK, and realising that sooner or later they would move from street activism and look for holistic answers. And if you look at what they've tended to do, they've tended to choose symbolic old guy. Okay, symbolic old honest socialist guy, which is in the USA Sanders, in Britain Jeremy Corbyn. All these people are, I think, honest and sincere politicians, but their socialism is the socialism of what we call the Keynesian era, the 60s and 70s, very state-orientated. I don't think it translates well economically to the world that we need to build. We need to build on small-scale production, startups, a mixture of non-profits, credit unions. Now, the kind of credit union, non-profit, startup, collaborative creche thing isn't really very high in the mix for the old left. And I think that, in other words, it's what we do ourselves rather than what we keep asking the state to do in the short term. But the scale of the crisis, will demand some very, very orthodox, old-fashioned left measures from the state, because quantitative easing the central bank isn't independent. It's an arm of the state. I think, however, there's got to still be a role for the state to do some very orthodox kind of old left measures. Quantitative easing is actually one of them. Right now, central banks are discussing what do we buy next. In Europe, they're thinking they've already bought the debt of companies. They're thinking about buying the shares of companies. Now, my argument there is, look, let's get together, let's network, let's decide our own agenda. If you can buy Volkswagen's debt, you could buy every auto loan in the country and write it off. You could write off every student loan, because we're talking about billions here. This is a new form of state intervention. It's not free, it doesn't come without cost, but it's the kind of thing I think we're going to have to do given the scale of the stagnation that's coming down the line.
But there is a political reality, and you report on a lot of it in this book and in your other books. You were in Gaza under the bombardment of the Israelis. You were in Greece following the kind of crushing of Syriza's agenda. What is your conclusion, having witnessed those situations and others? I've spoken to people involved in the Syriza fight who just said, sure, Europe was a problem, but our problems were also internal.
Yeah, of course. I'll say one thing, actually, about the parallel between those two situations. Obviously, you can't draw any parallel between a war and a simple economic crisis. But when you're sitting under a bombardment and you think nobody in the world cares about you, and there's nobody in the world really does care, and you're powerless, it did feel quite like that to sit in Greece when the European Union had switched off its banking system. Day 1 was fine, day 3 a bit stressful. Day 10 was very, very stressful. People were suddenly bursting into tears for no reason, quite ordinary, strong people. And I think that we are up against, we are up, against the global banking system has the financial and economic equivalent of Gaza to throw at any movement that wants to defy it. But I think, sure, Syriza made some mistakes. The mistake they made, Tsipras says to me in the documentary I made about him, we didn't fight soon enough. They didn't take seriously enough the threat that the Germans were going to smash them and literally subject 10 million people to possible starvation.
But they also say on the inside, we had systems that have been working the old way for generations.
Yeah.
It's not so easy to flip it around while you're in mid-flight.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the case. Funnily enough, Syriza had a whole department that was interested in the stuff I'm interested in: the collaborative economy, the wiring networks, villages, for free, all this. The actual guy in charge of that whole project got made head of the state energy company because they had to throw everything at what there was. What's the lesson? I mean, it is a lesson I think the American left can learn, because you have the far left, very hierarchical, very fixed in its old ways. You've got Sanders, quite from that old left tradition. And yet the mass base of the Sanders movement, of Corbyn in Britain, of Podemos in Spain, is not really interested in some of those things. It's interested in struggling itself and bringing its own power to make incremental change. And I think I think the people in the middle, the kind of the core, the organisers, need to stop, in America above all, need to stop flip-flopping between one day I'm a kind of person in Zuccotti Park under a tent, and the next minute I'm kind of with my little laptop and my Obama sticker or Sanders sticker or Howard Dean sticker. I'm playing the game of the normal politics. There's got to be somewhere in between. And I think the economics and the politics that are in my book are an attempt to arm people with what that in-between is.
It's great talking to you. Paul Mason's new book is Post-Capitalism, A Guide to Our Future. Check it out. We'll make a link available at our website. Great to see you.
Yeah, so to you.
ISIS has been sustaining defeats across Iraq and Syria in recent months, but that doesn't necessarily mean that peace is looming. In part, that's because the Middle East's wars are as much about politics as they are about military prowess. Longtime Middle East correspondent Patrick Cockburn is the author of a new book, Chaos and Caliphate: Jihadis and the West in the Struggle for the Middle East. I had a chance to talk with him about some of the themes in the new book earlier this year in his home in Ireland. Here's Patrick. Bring us up to date, Patrick. What's happening that we should understand about Syria these days?
The Syrian army has retaken Palmyra, the ancient city in eastern Syria, and defeated Islamic State in that area, which is very important because it's one of the biggest defeats that Islamic State has suffered. When Islamic State first arose in 2014, one of the things which propelled it forward was the idea it always won victories thanks to divine assistance. Then there was a line which was largely propaganda in the Gulf states, in the US and Europe, which said that the Syrian army and Assad never fought Islamic State. Now this was actually demonstrably untrue, and one could see this from the horrible videos that ISIS made, Islamic State made, showing Syrian soldiers being decapitated and shot in the head in 2014 and 2015. But that was a very widespread belief. And then when the Russian air intervention started on the 30th of September, there was another, what was essentially mostly propaganda, there was some substance in it, but saying that the Russians were only attacking moderate rebels. Nobody knows what these moderate rebels are. Was not attacking Islamic State. So the capture of Palmyra by the Syrian army and the Russians is important because it shows that actually they are fighting Islamic State. And this is the biggest defeat suffered by the organization.
You've been following the campaign. What do you make of the way that American candidates for president talk about the crisis?
Well, what strikes one about Hillary Clinton, all the Republican candidates, actually with perhaps the exception of Trump, is it's based on wishful thinking and often just fantasy of what they could do or what they have done. I mean, Hillary Clinton's record is not good. She was in favor of the Iraq War in 2003. She was very importantly favoured the Libyan intervention in 2011, though Obama seems to have had doubts about it. She was in favour of intervening in Syria in 2013. So it's very much a sort of traditional liberal with a small L, interventionist. The the Republican candidates, talk about Trump in a minute, generally it's sort of fantasy. And they accuse Hillary of the one thing she didn't do, which is really the responsibility for the US ambassador getting killed in Benghazi. Almost everything else she got wrong. It's the one thing that she doesn't have direct responsibility for. But that's all sort of based on fantasy. They would tear up the agreement with Iran. They would give full backing in every way to Israel. They would intervene against Assad. Some of these things aren't obvious. Hillary, for instance, in favor of safe zones in Syria. Sounds nice, safe zones for civilians, but hold on a minute. These safe zones, who's going to police them? Well, it might be the Turkish army, or the Turks saying they will be policed by Syrian armed moderates. But you then have to realize the Turkish definition of a moderate includes people like al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda representative in Syria, so a lot of these things are much more toxic than they look.
Finally, you've got two things happening at once. You've got the ISIS security question. You've also got this migration, refugee crisis. Borders are reappearing in Europe. What are you making of all this? Like, how do you both secure security and allow refugees to move?
Well, this was 2015 that finally the calamity that's happened to the Syrian and the Iraqi people suddenly is having an effect on Europe, and it's having its effect through two ways. One is these poor migrants struggling across the Aegean to get to Western Europe, and also terror attacks in Paris and Brussels and so forth. So suddenly it's become a big issue. And very little said, well, how come that we let this happen? Governments don't want to talk why this happened. They want to emote and have protest marches, but not actually say, well, actually, an awful lot of things we did was created this situation by letting the war and giving support to one side in the civil war in Syria and so forth.
Many places around the world are celebrating LGBTQ Pride this month. In lots of them, it had become a fairly routine part of the calendar until the deadly attack on the Orlando gay nightclub. In a tragic way, that attack has given this year's event some of its old significance. Pride in the streets wasn't always a ho-hum thing. In my experience, early Pride marches were defiant, riotous affairs, often complete with mini riots. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people striding out of the closet and into the streets was a brave, dramatic deal. We'd boo the bigotry of the church and the state and risk arrest over AIDS and murder. And then many of us who marched in the 80s started to skip it. I did. The monster floats had become so large and loud, and the people's banners so few and scrawny. Commerce seemed to have edged out community. And then there was the year that U.S. service people led the parade, the morning after a deadly U.S. bombing strike on Baghdad, Iraq. I didn't feel pride that year. I felt confused. Had liberation pride lost out to piece of the pie pride, such that we were now celebrating our place in war and killing? That revolution I found hard to dance to. I didn't marry, but I did couple up. I started missing pride and not thinking much about it. But a few months ago, a friend asked for my thoughts for a book she was compiling called Pride and Joy. The gifts I've received from pride parades are many. They're present in the freedom I feel, holding my lover's hand and kissing just about anywhere, in the image I have in my head of a massive rainbow of lives flowing down Fifth Avenue in New York, and the glimpse I got then and still see from time to time of a rambunctious, grand, queer festival of fun and fight that's seductive enough to overcome haters' fears and smart enough to embrace all our movements. At its best, pride is a chance to meet and mourn and resurrect the parts of ourselves we keep cooped up. Also, to practice stepping off our safe private places on the pavement and into the mad helter-skelter on the street. I marched before, and maybe I'll march again, to be reminded of the joy that is in the mix of singular, special people in a cavorting common crowd, defiant, brave, and dancing, different together. There's still plenty to mourn, and more to fight for and win. And we could, all of us, do with a lot more dancing. Happy Pride, everyone.